Mark, thank you for joining me. How are you? Are you okay?
I'm great, Harry. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I
Oh, no,
appreciate it.
thank you so much for taking the time. It's much appreciated. I'd love to talk to you, Mark, about your career history and your background. The reason for this podcast, as I've mentioned on previous podcasts, is to help market the actuarial sector in a positive light. Um, if there's one person out there who listens to this podcast, whether they're new to the industry, whether they're experienced, I'd like to think this podcast will be able to help them if they're looking to transition into different areas or to find out whether or not the actuarial market's for them or not. And I think with your background, Mark, I think you'd be in a very good place to help with your unique background, which we'll get into. Is that okay?
That sounds great.
Lovely, lovely. Well, I think best place to start was be your early career, Mark, and how you started. As you know, you started as an actuarial student in Canada. Um, what first attracted you to the actuarial path?
Well, in high school, I did well in math, and science and things like that. And my father was an accountant, so he was desperate for me to be an accountant. And I'd done the accounting courses, and it was it seemed to come easily to me, but unfortunately for my dad, I was the kind of son who didn't really want to do, you know, exactly what his dad did. So actuarial science was presented to me by a guidance person. It sounded similar in a lot of regards. It and so I think obviously the math was there, but they also mentioned that you might even get to use computers. So that didn't come with a description of accounting at the time. So I think that, believe it or not, was what tipped the scales. So I got started really in my actuarial courses and my actuarial exams as soon as I started college or university, as we call it. So that quick start it turned out to be a two-edged sword, but it was what it was.
Absolutely, and we'll go into your career in further detail further down the line. But you worked at MetLife, and then from there you went to Wall Street, which some may see from the outside as a big pivot. What gave you the confidence to make that kind of move?
Well, I was still pretty young. I qualified probably within a year of that when I actually switched. And I had transferred from MetLife's Canada office down to the U.S. office, and there are other actuaries like me who were Canadians working in New York. So it was great that there was sort of a natural, a handful of guys that were almost natural mentors to me, right, who had done the same thing that I did. And one of them I knew well enough to say, look, I'm very interested in the investment side, as everybody knew that. And I got this job offer from Morgan Stanley. I had really no idea who Morgan Stanley was. And the one fellow said, look, you have to do this, right? So let's suppose that they don't like you, you don't like them. Frankly, where you are in your career, with your certification, if that doesn't work out, you're going to have your old job back or one just like it in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah,
And if it does work out, who knows where it might go? So it was sort of that asymmetry of outcomes that I think convinced me that it was that it was worth taking the chance. With 2020 hindsight, it worked extremely well. But I'm without that guidance, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have done it.
that guidance is something not every actuary gets, right? I think sometimes you need a nudge or someone to be in your corner to give you that confidence to be able to make that leap. I guess and I'm guessing here, one of the people get nervous about different kind of work cultures, right? And going from a traditional actuarial role to say a Morgan Stanley or a Goldman Sachs can be a big leap, or the perception can be seen as it is going to be
Yes.
a big leap. Was that the case at all, or was it more simple than that?
No, I'd say it was a giant leap. And
Yeah.
it was very, walking in and sitting down, not in the middle of the trading floor, but kind of at the edge of the trading floor was, I was like, well, where's my office? And it wasn't at all like that. And I think the other thing that was completely different was that my role there was really to work with salespeople to solve client
Yeah.
problems. So in insurance, everyone kind of knows the products that are being delivered at the end of the day by some agent or online or whatever. Here everything was bespoke, everything was different. Um, that's what made it a great learning environment.
Yeah.
But it was basically 180 degrees from, the insurance company, hierarchy, badge in, sit in your office, wait for someone to ask you a question, kind of mentality.
Yeah. And I can imagine coming from your background, an actuarial background, you added something different in the investment banking world as to maybe what's already there, right?
Yes, well, actually, I guess the other thing that I probably should point out at the time is I was very interested in investments, and I went out of my way, having just finished the actuarial exams, to sit for the first CFA exam.
Okay.
Um, and when it came, interviewing for Wall Street, I was able to say, look, I have the first CFA exam. So they at least knew what that was, right? That was
Yeah.
tangible to the people who were interviewing me. And I think set me apart from other actuaries who I know they talked to who couldn't say the same thing.
Yeah.
But they well, it was an environment where interest rates had just gone sky high, and insurance companies were offering different products. Nobody was really sure how to invest for those products. So I think that the good thing was that Wall Street in general and Morgan Stanley knew that they needed that expertise,
Yeah.
right? So they went looking for it, and they chose me. It wasn't like I broke in out of the blue, uninvited, or anything like that. And the salespeople knew, who were covering insurance companies. They knew, this is your guy. Take him out there to see the insurance company, see how we can help them. So that was really a great a great way to start.
I speak to actuaries kind of day in, day out, and a popular move is to go from that actuarial space into that investment world. And I think taking a CFA exam, as you've mentioned, it shows you're serious, right? It shows that it's something that you're genuinely interested in. I think a lot maybe look over at the other side of the fence, and that looks quite good, or that's something I'm interested in. But taking that exam and showing, no, this is what I want to do. I've done this to kind of prove that. I think that's quite important, and that's the advice I always tend to try to give to people who want to make that leap. It's not just an option, or it's something that you could do. You've got to show to a potential employer that you're serious about making that move. So that resonates. Um, Going into that type of environment, Wall Street as an actuary. Um, was it a natural fit, or did you ever feel kind of overwhelmed or out of place?
Well, I knew I'd be out of place, but as I said, I say Morgan Stanley or other investment banks, they were looking for that expertise. So
Yeah.
that was a good fit. I got to go and visit clients, and it also gave me an environment to learn what Wall Street was about and what they were doing. Right. I
Yeah.
mean, I was you know, perceived to be a smart person, but a new person coming from a very different background. So, I think that ability to ask a lot of questions, when that guy was yelling this, what did he mean?
Yeah.
Or what kind of business do you normally do with an insurance company? What do we do? What do other companies do? It gave me just a great environment to be able to ask those questions. And I learned pretty quickly that was really that curiosity, was what was the one thing I needed.
Yeah.
I was, I had, uh, quote unquote, smart enough to figure out anything that was going on there. I didn't come knowing it, but smart enough to figure it out and put in the middle of that environment. And I'm certain anyone who, has, even started their actuarial exams, it's not like you're not going to be able to figure it out.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's,
You touched on an interesting point there about being curious and asking questions, because you've sent it actuaries that are clearly very intelligent people, right? Um, Some want to give the perception that they know everything, right? You know all the answers to all the questions. Um, you've just you said you went in there asking questions almost deliberately in regards to having conversations and speaking to people and almost being completely brand new and going, what's that and what's this? Was that something that was natural to you? Was that easy for you to do? Or
I think it was. I mean, it was good because, like I said, I think people knew I was coming from somewhere different.
yeah,
But it was also, I think it is a personal trait that's very valuable because
yeah,
I remember I sat down and met this guy who was sitting beside me, and he's from Harvard. He pointed out in the first sentence, and I think that yeah, this is a generalization based on one person, but I think sometimes when people kind of come with a pedigree like that,
yeah,
they're maybe a little bit more hesitant to ask the
yeah,
basic questions,
hmm,
right? Like, where the duckies and the ponies, like, well, what's going on here?
yeah,
Because you want to, maintain sort of that aura
of
of,
course,
really, really smart person. So, and I would, not to jump ahead, I'd say the same thing in risk management. In risk management, even if you know everything about something, you'll be a better risk manager if you don't really divulge that, if you let people talk about it, you ask them questions and you see who knows what and who doesn't know what. Yeah, you'll probably learn along the way, but sort of understanding and hearing it in other people's words is very valuable. And a lot of times it's not a natural actuarial thing, right?
yeah, yeah,
Or like, we actuaries, we like to think we're the smartest ones in the room. Sometimes you have to have the mentality of, no, I'm not, and I need to learn.
yeah.
And so I think in 2020 hindsight, that was really important.
Yeah, yeah. And I spoke to a previous guest on the podcast about actuarial leadership and the importance of speaking last, is what they told me. You go into a meeting or a room, everyone's very keen to impress, everyone's very keen to show what they know, right? But good leaders listen first and then act after. And that
Yeah.
can perhaps not be a most natural thing for people in that environment, which moves me nicely onto kind of next topic of questions with regards to leadership and risk and resilience too, because moving further ahead into your career, Mark, you moved into CRO roles and CIO roles, which is a big shift, right? And
Mhm.
I guess I'm keen to understand what lessons you took from those leadership positions for people at home listening.
Well, I think I was fortunate that I went from Wall Street right into to GE. And GE, as I think a lot of people know, I mean, there's kind of leadership. How do you do it? There's
Yeah,
courses. There's, you do this, you do that, because they're trying to, be a conglomerate and do things consistently between different industries. And so there's kind of almost a, I hate to say textbook, but they have a lot of coaching, a lot of examples. So I wasn't going in, without that. I think what I realized very early on was no matter where you came from, if you come in and sit in one of those, see something roles, um, pretty quickly you need to have an agenda.
yep,
It can't just be, hey, I'm the new sheriff in town, so you'll do this and you'll do that. You need to be able to start at the beginning and say, look, here's what we need to do more of. Here's how we're going to do it. We may change as we go, but you need to be able to say that pretty clearly to everybody in the organization and give them an update on, those things that I told you. How are we doing on those? Um, you can't claim to be perfect, or you don't want them to expect that it will be perfect.
yeah,
But I think that was a great help to me looking back to do it in that environment.
yeah,
But I think the having an agenda is real important because you don't want to come in, sit in the seat and say, "Hey, look, everyone, I've got the big seat. Come and and do this and do that.
Yeah, yeah,
They're going to want to hear, okay, here's a new guy, sorry, new person. What do they, what do they want to accomplish? What do they see as success?
yeah.
So, I found out pretty quickly that that was going to work well, and it did.
And in those positions, you can have the best will in the world, right? In regards to you come in with a plan, you've got and you've got something you want to execute. Sometimes the world has different ideas for you, and I want to talk to you about the financial crisis of 2008, right? Where you were probably very likely in the thick of it, and what that experience was like, and how it shaped your own views on risk and responsibility.
Well, I certainly was in the middle of it because I had gone from being the chief risk officer to being the chief investment officer.
Yeah,
It's, in some people's estimation, that seemed like I had caused the crisis.
yeah,
But, in the end, it cost me my job.
yeah,
That was a shock. It also happened at the same time a lot of people with similar backgrounds lost their jobs.
of course.
So that was not something that I had expected. Um, I guess in hindsight, um, don't don't rely on the rating agencies to do their job.
Yeah,
Do
yeah,
your own risk management. I think for us, we were spun out of GE into Genworth. So we had, as GE sold down, board members were turning over pretty quickly. And, I think the other specific learning was, new board member comes on board doesn't mean they know what the company does, or they really know how you make money or what would cause you to lose money. And, if they're surprised to find that out the hard way, um, it's real hard to have that conversation. It's infinitely easier at the very beginning, even at the risk of almost insulting them, to be really
yeah,
basic and say, look, here's what we do. Here's what we're worried about. Here's what can happen. Um, because once it happens, it's pretty emotional, and people feel as though they need to take action, etc. So, that was, yeah, I did learn a lot about responsibility, and,
yeah.
in terms of what you're responsible for, and what others might appear to be responsible for, but in the end, they really aren't. It's you.
Absolutely. And I guess I want to touch upon your role as Chief Risk Officer, and what you see the differences back then as to what they are today, or when you first stepped into the role.
Sure. I think that, again, risk at GE and a GE spinoff was a pretty specific thing. There were certain things you were expected to deliver. Um, and as my career moved beyond that, and especially when I was a consultant to other CROs, realized pretty quickly that risk is different in every organization. What's expected of risk, how it's staffed. Is it 0.001% of the budget, or is it 1%? I mean, it's thought of differently. There's usually a history in terms of what risk has done, and what's expected. And I get I get the feeling these days that risk and controllership, that's not equated with growth,
Yep.
and that it in some sense kind of out of favor. '08 was a long time ago, well before careers started for a lot of people who were in the workforce. And so I think for anyone who's in risk management, I think you have to make sure people understand what it is, and where it can help. Um, that was actually it is probably worth the one anecdote that was a wake up call for me. Um, when GE was doing the IPO and spinning off all this insurance business into Genworth, risk management was a decent part of that pitch to investors, right? Here's what we do. Here's the people we have. Here's the example of some of the calculations we do and some of the reports. And one analyst asked me a question that, frankly, I wasn't ready for. He said, "Well, what have you ever stopped the company from doing? And I did have an answer to that. I probably only had one. Thankfully, he didn't ask me more than once. But later on, as I was a consultant to CROs, and you try that question on people, a lot of times they'll be like, "Well, no, we stay within our risk appetite. We don't, there's no anecdote of like where does the kind of the rubber hit the road for risk management." So, I think if risk management needs to be ready with those anecdotes, because I think in an environment where, your share of the budget more likely to go down than it is to go up, you need to go in there ready for that conversation. And I think that's the best way to be ready for it.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Mark. That was a detailed and really good answer. I think a lot of people benefit from that, and kind of moving into that in regards to career advice for people out there, but specifically actuaries. We've touched upon your background. We've gone through your career, and you weren't shy to make the big moves, right? I speak to actuaries on a daily basis who feel like once they're in pensions, that's them. They're in pensions, or once they're insurance, that's it. That's their career. They're going to be insurance, and sometimes feel a bit disillusioned that almost their career path is laid out before them, and they're in their 30s, let's say, for example.
Yeah.
Um, what advice would you give to those who are curious about exploring opportunities outside the traditional path?
Well, I guess the first thing is to ask yourself, are you comfortable not being the smartest person in the room? Because you probably won't be as soon as you step off that career path, right?
Yeah,
And is that kind of environment where you're going to thrive, or are you just going to wither and slink back to your office and try to find the right thing to read and get smarter? Because you're going to run into that, not being the smartest person in the room, whether it's real or perceived or whatever. I think that the analogy back to my decision to go to Wall Street was, if you have the professional qualification, and you are on a track, be it pensions or insurance or whatever, um, think of it as an option. You could probably go back to that. If you try something and you do a belly flop, there's a pretty good chance that you can go back and the amount of, net career interruption would be minimal. I think
yeah,
that's the beauty of a qualification. And actuaries are perceived as being very smart people. And frankly, if I were that person, I were in my 30s today, I'd be, well, you know, AI is a new thing.
yeah,
AI needs smart people. And climate change is kind of the disruption of our generation, right? And a lot of people are trying to do different things to combat that problem. And because both of those things are new,
yeah,
there is no big body of people who have spent their career trained in that area. So coming in and say, "Hey, I'm an actuary. Here's something I've worked on that might be applicable." It's that's not crazy.
yeah,
And frankly, a group of people who are working on climate risk or AI may be happy to have a different perspective in the room. A smart person, but someone who has a different type of training, can provide a different perspective. So, I think it's important to keep that in mind.
of
Um,
course.
Again, that asymmetry of outcomes is you kind of have an option, and if you never use it, you're kind of letting it expire.
Yeah, yeah,
So I anyway, that worked for me, and it worked for me later in a later career move from Morgan Stanley to Goldman. Where I had a chance to take a job in another American Wall Street firm, but a different job in terms of it kind of encompassed everything that Goldman did. It wasn't specific to fixed income, which was a stretch for me. And but again, I looked at it the same way. I said, well, if it doesn't work, Goldman doesn't like me or I don't like them. I may not be able to go straight back to Morgan Stanley, but there are other firms who are going to
Yeah.
recognize that background, and pretty good chance that I could get a job similar to my old one if it didn't work out. So, I would just, as general advice, I would encourage people to think that way.
Yeah. What's the Dr. Pepper slogan? What's the worst that can happen? Is that it? Have I got that right? So there you go. Okay. And making that jump as you did, you've seen a lot of different qualities and attributes that people bring, and especially across the actuarial sector as well. You spoke about AI, and you spoke about climate risk change. Um, Actuaries are known as being very technical people, technically very good. Are there any other attributes that you think people should develop if they want to be successful making that leap across into a brand new area?
I think it would really be the curiosity again.
Yeah,
If you don't jump out of bed and be curious to learn something, um, there are other people who are, and
yeah,
and at the end of the day, they're going to end up learning, probably more than you. So, I think it's one of those questions to ask yourself: is it really me? Because I think that's in the long run, and I guess looking back at a long career, it's amazing how long a career is.
yeah,
um, so, curiosity, just general curiosity. And it might even start with curiosity about new people you're working with. What's their background? What got them where they are? Um, Curiosity, and so I would say that's probably number one, number two, and number three. And that other point about, just don't be afraid to, talk out loud and make friends. That kind of informal mentoring, um, is a great thing too. And a lot of times that's not a natural for actuaries who think about their rank and where they sit in the
yeah,
hierarchy of actuaries. Just finding somebody who's can provide some perspective on different jobs and different careers. Yeah, a lot of companies formally offer that, right? I think trying to find that informally
hmm
could be a lot more effective. That
away from
was
a
Yeah,
business
that
setting.
was my
Yeah.
experience.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a tough question now, Mark. And I think you'll understand why it will be a tough question once I answer it, once I ask it. Um, Looking back, what would you say was the single most important decision that shaped your career trajectory?
Well, it was definitely that move, when
Yeah,
I was in my 20s, and, I went out of the insurance world into investment banking and Wall Street. Um, that was a turn in the road.
yeah,
And it worked great for me. I did it, while I was pretty early in my career. But I think, as we talked about before, the steps before that enabled that, right? Just being infinitely curious about the investment department at MetLife, and, trying to get through the door there and make friends, and, talk about what they did. And sitting for the CFA exam was a way to kind of get onto their wavelength, and, you know, be able to ask smarter questions to them.
yeah,
And so I think that, I think in hindsight, that move, and that, looking at it, like I said, the sort of the asymmetry of, like, hey, you kind of got an option because the outcomes are not symmetric.
yeah,
Um, and there'll be other times in your career, as I mentioned as well, where that's probably going to be the case. So don't forget about that.
yeah,
That was definitely the most important one. And again, without having a mentor, um, somebody, that could give you that kind of strong career advice,
hmm
um, pretty sure I never would have done it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Would you say that, looking back on your career, Mark, now you're retired, would you say that was one of the best things you had was that mentor, or would you perhaps give yourself some different advice when you were first starting out in Canada at MetLife?
Yeah, it's always hard when you look back and like, well, what if you hadn't gone to that meeting and asked that question, whatever. Um, because when you do look back, there are some, three or four sort of fateful circumstances that did impact it. Um, the move to the UK and basically working in Europe was a bit of a fluke, and I really only got the opportunity because two other guys turned it down because their wives said, "No way, I'd never do that." So there are other things. There are going to be a lot of things you can't predict.
Yeah.
But I think keeping that curiosity and keeping that perspective of you know if if I go to something new and it's a complete face plant, how bad is it going to be? What's the severity in reality? Probably not as bad as you think.
Okay. Thank you for that, Mark. Um, I'd like to speak to you about post-retirement, and in particular, writing, Mark. Um, you retired during COVID, and you took an unusual path and pursued writing. Um, that's not often two things you put together, actuarial and writing. How did that transition come about?
Well, I think I I don't know that one day the light came on and said, "Hey, why don't I try this?" Although, right, yeah, as we've discussed, I there have been other times in my career where I had tried different things.
Yeah,
Um, it was actually kind of it was kind of the plot of the first book that kind of came to me, and that was the thing. Like, I had written plenty of stuff professionally, articles, papers, stuff like that, so I wasn't afraid to write. And I think it was kind of that the plot kind of came to me more than some, career guidance or, intuition or anything like that. So maybe it was a bit of a fluke. But I think that that was really the way it started, to be honest.
okay. Well, I'd love to speak to you about a book you've wrote, Mark. Your debut thriller, The Mortality Thief, which weaves actuarial and mortality themes into fiction. Keen to understand what inspired you to write such a storyline.
The So as I mentioned, this plot just what actually happened is I worked for in the UK for a bunch of years, and it's kind of the middle of my career, and I was back in the UK in a different role, and just the way something kind of went wrong with the calendar, and I ended up in London for 2 days that weren't work days, for me with really nothing to do. And, changing my flight was hideously expensive. So I just spent those 2 days in London. I didn't, having lived there, I didn't need to go and see the sights or anything like that. And I just, really kind of started wandering around. I was in Hyde Park and I found these gentlemen. They were veterans. They all had PTSD. I had the time to sit and talk to them.
Yeah.
And, I got on a bus, which I never, would have done back in the day, just to see where it would go.
Mhm.
As I kind of wandered around, I think my mind started to wander around and probably wandered back to what I was doing when I lived in the UK. I had contact with a number of homeless people. I, saw one, ambulance pick up somebody, and so I'm an EMT as well. And so whenever you see something like that, or you see an ambulance like zooming away, you're wondering, what's going on inside that ambulance. Um, and then I was down in close to the Thames, a place called Furnival Gardens, and I came across this little link. Um, a very unusual thing, a link back to the content of the actuarial exams in a place and a time that really surprised me. And I think that kind of started a lot of things to crystallize in my mind of like thinking about all of these things, just thinking about kind of living a different life in London, and then that connection to the start of my professional career. And when you read the book, you'll know what I'm talking about, because it kind of comes out of the blue and it changes the character's perspective on what he's going to do. And it was the same thing for me. It was I don't know. I just plus I also had the time to didn't think about it. So as I said, it was kind of that plot kind of crystallized, and then when I was interested in having the book published, and it was very hard to get even a conversation with a publisher when you don't have a typical background. I don't have a book of poetry or
Hmm.
anything like that to go by. Um, and they said, well, if you're gonna, a publisher would be more interested if you commit to more than one book. Um, so I think that's really when I started thinking about, well, like what else would I want to write about? And so rest assured, there aren't three books about mortality. That is kind of the starting point,
Yeah.
right, but you really, really know. But there's definitely others in the works. They're more centered around that disruption I talked about before, about climate risk and what that does to, different people and different organizations. So it's kind of funny. It kind of rose from the ground in terms of being like an overall master plan
Mm.
of becoming a writer.
Absolutely. And you touched upon it there. You write about what you know, right? And
Yep.
you've wrote this book. You know a lot about risk management. Do you see any parallels there at all?
Yes, I think there actually are some quite interesting parallels as I kind of learned more about writing and the form of writing. Once I'd started this, risk management typically starts with a financial plan for an organization, and the job of risk management is to say, well, what can change? Like, what are the disruptions? Probably mostly external disruptions that can happen. How will that work its way through the organization financially? What will the people do? What will other organizations do? Regulators, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and as a risk manager, people count on you thinking about all of those different failure modes. What are the things that can go wrong, and what are those disruptions, and then putting statistics around it and stuff like that. And in the writing world, that disruption, if you're writing a thriller, is known as the inciting incident. Right? It's the thing that causes the main character to say, "I got to go off and do something, completely different." And then you have characters, and characters are people. Characters are institutions, and even governments. How are they impacted by that disruption? So there's actually a kind of an interesting parallel there, I think.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the great thing about being a writer is that you don't need to put a probability on 1,000 different scenarios. You just need to pick one that you think that you want to write about, and that you think will keep people will keep turning the pages, right?
That people want to
So
read. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's a natural, excuse me, progression from being a risk manager to picking out that one scenario, i.e., plot, and just going into it in detail. So, it's been fun to do, and I'm looking forward to doing a lot more of it.
I think people are really going to like the uniqueness of the book, Mark. It's different. Um, People cry out for different, right? We see the same films remade over
It's
and
you
over
know it's
again.
it's
And
definitely different, and
yeah,
you know it's it's short, it's quick, right? It's a small book, and it's, I think, will also, because the setting is an IPO, will also appeal to people who work broadly in corporate governance,
yeah,
to people who work on IPOs. There certainly is an IT element, an IT security element to it, so I think that will be interesting. And not to give it away, but my character is, he's leaning heavily on his actuarial knowledge to solve this mystery. And at the end of the day, it's not kind of getting him all the way there. So, he kind of goes to the bottom of his laptop and finds some Python code and tries to kind of mix AI with his professional knowledge, which I think is it's a I think it's a great topic in any industry of, how do you go from being a professional and feeling like you know everything there is to know, and you're one of a finite number of people who really know that, and then you have this other capability that really knows nothing but is sort of infinitely smart and infinitely fast and just keeps gaining on you. um, how do you deal with that? How do you marry with that or rage against it? I think is I think a lot of people, a lot of industries are in the midst of dealing with that right now. So the story is an example of that, of that phenomenon in the insurance space.
It's another example of you reinventing yourself, Mark. Actuary, Wall Street, author now. Um, what does success look like for you now? Now you're in this new chapter.
Um, it's I didn't set out with a goal of, I want to sell X books or anything like that. I think my short-term goal is to, and shame on me, I don't even know what this number is, but to sell enough books, the first time around that I can get a publisher or an agent interested in
Yeah,
the second time around. And that's kind of the, hand to mouth author,
yeah,
day to day thing. Looking further ahead, I think that the disruption that I want to write about, that I want my plots to be focused on, is really more about climate risk and the environment,
yeah.
and how that's going to impact people, how it's going to impact companies, how it's going to impact governments and everything. I think that's a huge disruption, which makes it a great topic for a thriller. A lot of inciting incidents and things that can happen there. So I think that's where it's all headed.
Amazing. And for people listening or watching at home, how can they buy it? When's it released?
It's released a week from today, September 18th. The way to buy it is to just browse the Mortality Thief. Will come up in there, and another way to that will get you to Amazon, and or if you want to go to the website markwgriffin.com, there's more background there. There's some Q&A that I did there. Other things that are hopefully of interest. And there's you can connect with me. I would really enjoy that. And as I said, it's not a huge book, but I think it's fun, and I think people who understand the insurance business will kind of go, wow, that's about that subject is what I do.
Well, I look forward to reading it. And Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I think a lot of people are going to be very interested in hearing your background and the career so far and what you've done since retirement. So I just want to say thank you so much again for taking the time and yeah, look forward to reading the book.
Great. Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity, to go through all those years. I hope it is helpful to people. I'm sure it would be. And of course, to talk about the book. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Harry.
No problem. Thanks, Mark.